Sarah Martinez had always trusted the wrong people, but this time her poor judgment might cost her everything. The sun blazed overhead like a merciless furnace as she stumbled across the endless stretch of sand, her lips already cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Just 12 hours earlier, she had been sitting in an air-conditioned restaurant in Phoenix, believing the lies that Marcus and his crew had fed her about a simple delivery job. Marcus had seemed so convincing with his expensive suit and gold watch, promising her $5,000 just to drive a package to a remote location in the Sonoran Desert. Sarah, a single mother struggling to pay her rent and her daughter's medical bills, had jumped at the opportunity without asking enough questions. She should have known better when Marcus insisted she go alone and leave her phone behind for security reasons. The black SUV had followed her for the last 30 miles of the journey, staying just far enough back that she couldn't see the faces inside. When she finally reached the coordinates Marcus had given her, nothing but empty desert stretched in every direction. The package delivery was supposed to be simple. Just hand it over to someone named Rodriguez and collect her money. But Rodriguez never showed up. Instead, 3 men emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, their faces covered with bandanas. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized she had walked into a trap. The leader, a tall man with cold eyes, spoke with a thick accent that she couldn't place. "You bring the package, yes?" he asked, extending his hand. Sarah's hands shook as she retrieved the small box from her car. She had no idea what was inside, and now she was terrified to find out. The man opened it carefully, revealing what looked like computer components and small electronic devices. He nodded approvingly to his companions before turning his attention back to Sarah. "You have done well," he said, but his smile was predatory. "Now we have a problem." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "What problem?" "I delivered the package like I was supposed to. Marcus said someone would pay me here." The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty desert. "Marcus works for us now. He told us you might become curious about your cargo. We cannot allow loose ends." Before Sarah could react, one of the other men grabbed her car keys while the third searched her pockets for any identification. They found her wallet, driver's license, and the business car Marcus had given her. The leader studied her ID carefully, memorizing her address. "Sarah Martinez, 2847 Oak Street, Phoenix," he read aloud. "You have a daughter, yes?" "Emma, age 8. Terror flooded through Sarah's veins like ice water. "How do you know about my daughter? What do you want?" "We know many things," the man replied calmly. "Your daughter is safe for now, but that will depend entirely on your cooperation." They forced Sarah to sit on the ground while they made several phone calls in a language she didn't recognize. She caught fragments of English mixed in, words like delivery, disposal, and problem solved. Each word made her stomach clench tighter with fear. After 20 minutes of discussion, the leader approached her again. "Here is what will happen," he announced. "You will walk into the desert in that direction." He pointed toward a range of distant mountains that shimmered like a mirage in the heat. "You will walk until you can walk no more. If you try to return to your car, we will kill you. If you somehow survive and contact the police, we will kill your daughter." "You can't be serious," Sarah whispered. "This is murder." "No," the man corrected her. "This is business. You delivered illegal weapons components across state lines. If the authorities find your body, they will assume you were working with cartels and died in a deal gone wrong. Your daughter will be placed in foster care, and no one will ask too many questions about a dead criminal." Sarah's world spun around her as the full horror of her situation became clear. She had unknowingly transported weapons parts for terrorists or criminals, and now they were going to let the desert kill her to keep their operation secret. Even worse, they knew where her daughter lived. "Please," she begged, falling to her knees. "I have money saved. I can pay you. Just let me go back to my daughter." The leader shook his head. "Money cannot solve this problem. You have seen our faces. You know about the delivery route. You are what you Americans call a liability." They dragged her to her feet and pushed her toward the open desert. One of the men handed her an empty water bottle, a cruel joke that made them all laugh. For the show, he explained. So, when they find your body, it looks like you try to survive. Sarah stumbled forward on legs that felt like rubber, her mind racing for any possible escape plan. Behind her, she heard her car engine starting and the sound of vehicles driving away. She was alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, with no water, no shelter, and no hope of rescue. The sun was already beginning to take its toll on her body. Her shirt clung to her skin with sweat, and she could feel moisture evaporating from her mouth and lungs with every breath. The sand reflected the heat back at her like an oven, and the temperature had to be well over 100 degrees. As she walked, Sarah thought about Emma waiting for her to come home from what should have been a simple job. Her daughter had been so excited when Sarah promised to take her to Disneyland with the money from this delivery. Now Emma would be waiting forever for a mother who would never return. The landscape around her was a moonscape of sand, rocks, and scattered desert plants that offered no shade or relief. In every direction, the horizon wavered with heat distortion, making it impossible to judge distances or navigate by landmarks. She had no compass, no map, and no real idea which direction might lead to safety. After walking for what felt like hours, Sarah's legs began to shake with exhaustion. The sun had moved higher in the sky, and the temperature was becoming unbearable. She sought shelter behind a large boulder and tried to think rationally about her situation. The men had taken her car and left her die, but they had also made a crucial mistake. They assumed she would simply walk in a straight line until she collapsed, but Sarah had watched enough survival shows to know better. If she could find water and shelter, she might survive long enough for someone to find her. The problem was that this part of the Sonoran Desert was virtually uninhabited. The nearest road could be 20 miles away in any direction, and she had no way of knowing which way to go. Worse, if she chose the wrong direction, she would only take herself further from potential rescue. As she sat in the meager shade of the boulder, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. There were tire tracks in the sand nearby, barely visible, but definitely there. They were older tracks, not from her car or the men who had abandoned her, but they proved that vehicles sometimes passed through this area. Following tire tracks was risky because they might lead deeper into the desert, but they were also her only clue about which direction might lead to civilization. Sarah made the difficult decision to follow them, hoping they would eventually lead to a road or settlement. The tracks led generally toward the east, where the mountains looked slightly closer. Sarah began walking again, using her empty water bottle as a makeshift hat to shade her head from the relentless sun. Every step was an effort, and she could feel her body temperature rising dangerously. As the hours passed, the heat became almost unbearable. Sarah's vision began to blur, and she started making mistakes, stumbling over small rocks, walking in slight circles without realizing it. The tire tracks became harder and harder to follow as the wind had partially erased them in some places. By mid-afternoon, Sarah was in serious trouble. She had been walking for 6 hours without water in extreme heat, and her body was beginning to shut down. Her skin felt like it was on fire, and she was no longer sweating because her body had no moisture left to spare. That's when she saw it, a glint of metal in the distance that might be a building or a vehicle. Sarah forced herself to keep walking toward it, using every ounce of willpower she had left. As she got closer, she realized it was an abandoned mining shack, probably left over from decades ago when prospectors had worked this area. The shack was falling apart with holes in the roof and no door, but it offered blessed shade from the sun. Sarah collapsed inside, grateful to be out of the direct heat, even though the temperature inside was still over 90 degrees. She searched the shack desperately for any sign of water, but found nothing except rusty mining equipment and debris. However, she did notice that the floor was concrete, which meant this had been a more substantial operation than she had first thought. There might be other buildings nearby, or even an old well. As Sarah rested in the shade, she tried to develop a survival plan. The men who had abandoned her expected her to be dead by morning, which meant she had perhaps 12 hours to find water and signal for help. After dark, the desert temperature would drop dramatically, giving her a better chance to travel without overheating. She also realized that her disappearance might not go unnoticed as quickly as the men hoped. Emma was staying with Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, who would expect Sarah to pick her up by evening. When Sarah didn't show up, Mrs. Garcia would start asking questions and eventually contact the police. The problem was that even if the police started looking for her, they had no idea where to search. Sarah had told Mrs. Garcia she was going to deliver a package, but she hadn't mentioned where. The phone number Marcus had given her was probably fake, and there was no paper trail leading to this remote location. As evening approached, Sarah made a crucial decision. Instead of trying to walk out of the desert, she would stay near the mining shack and try to signal for help. If search aircraft came looking for her, they would have a better chance of spotting her if she stayed in one place and made herself visible. Using debris from the shack, Sarah built a large arrow pointing toward her location and used her white shirt to create a flag that would be visible from the air. She also gathered dry wood and paper to build a signal fire when the time was right. As darkness fell, the desert temperature dropped quickly, and Sarah felt strong enough to explore the area around the shack more thoroughly. She found the ruins of 2 other buildings and what looked like the remains of an old access road. More importantly, she discovered a rusted water tank that still contained a few inches of stagnant water at the bottom. The water smelled terrible and was full of rust and debris, but it was water. Sarah used her shirt as a filter and managed to drink about a cup of the foul liquid. It tasted like metal and mud, but she could feel her body absorbing it gratefully. With water in her system and the temperature more bearable, Sarah felt a surge of hope. She had survived the first day, and now she had a base camp with some shelter and a small water source. If she was smart and careful, she might be able to stay alive long enough for rescue to arrive. That night, as she lay on the concrete floor of the mining shack, Sarah stared up at more stars than she had ever seen in her life. The desert sky was crystal clear, and the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. For a moment, she almost forgot about her desperate situation and simply marveled at the beauty above her. But beauty wouldn't save her life. Somewhere out there, dangerous men were going about their business, confident that they had eliminated a threat to their operation. They had no idea that Sarah Martinez was tougher than they had given her credit for, and that she had no intention of dying quietly in the desert. As she drifted off to an uneasy sleep, Sarah made herself a promise. If she survived this ordeal, she would make sure the men who had tried to kill her faced justice. More importantly, she would make it home to Emma, no matter what it took. The desert night was full of sounds, coyotes howling in the distance, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush, and the whisper of wind across the sand. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and tried to stay warm as the temperature dropped into the 50s. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but tonight she was alive. She had water, shelter, and a plan. Most importantly, she had hope, and in the vast emptiness of the Sonoran Desert, hope was the most precious resource of all. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day in the desert. Sarah woke to the sound of her stomach cramping with hunger and the metallic taste of the contaminated water still coating her mouth. She had managed to sleep in short intervals throughout the night, but every sound had jolted her awake, wondering if the men had returned to make sure she was dead. The temperature was still cool in the early morning hours, giving Sarah a window of opportunity to explore her surroundings more thoroughly. She needed to find more water, some form of food, and materials to improve her signaling capabilities. Most importantly, she needed to stay alive long enough for someone to mount a search operation. As she stepped outside the mining shack, Sarah was struck by how different the desert looked in daylight. What had seemed like an endless wasteland the day before now revealed subtle variations in terrain and vegetation. She could see a dry creek bed winding through the landscape about half a mile away, and several clusters of desert plants that might provide shade or even edible parts. Sarah decided to follow the creek bed, reasoning that even if it was dry now, it might lead to a water source or connect to a larger drainage system that could take her towards civilization. Before leaving, she arranged rocks near the shack to spell out "Help" in letters large enough to be seen from aircraft. The creek bed was a revelation. As Sarah followed its winding path, she discovered that what looked completely dry from a distance actually contained small pools of water trapped in rocky depressions. The water was clearer than what she had found in the mining camp, though she still filtered it through her shirt before drinking. More importantly, the creek bed showed recent signs of animal activity. There were tracks in the sand from deer, rabbits, and other desert wildlife, which meant this area had reliable water sources. If animals could survive here, so could she, at least for a few more days. Following the tracks led Sarah to her first real piece of luck since being abandoned. Hidden beneath an overhanging rock formation was a natural spring that bubbled up from underground and created a small oasis of green vegetation. The water was crystal clear and tasted sweet after the contaminated liquid she had been drinking. Sarah spent the morning at the spring, drinking her fill and soaking her feet in the cool water. She also discovered that some of the plants growing nearby were edible, prickly pear cactus pads that could be prepared safely, and desert sage that might help settle her stomach. As she prepared to return to the mining camp with containers full of fresh water, Sarah heard a sound that made her freeze in terror. It was the distant rumble of vehicle engines, and they were getting closer. Her first thought was that the men had returned to check on their handiwork, but as the sound grew louder, she realized there were too many engines for it to be the same small group. Sarah scrambled up the rocks above the spring to get a better view of the surrounding area. In the distance, she could see a convoy of vehicles moving slowly across the desert, following what appeared to be an old mining road she hadn't noticed before. The vehicles were painted in desert camouflage, and even from her hiding spot, Sarah could see armed figures moving with military precision. Her heart raced as she tried to decide whether these newcomers represented salvation or an even worse threat. Were they government forces who might rescue her, or were they connected to the men who had abandoned her? Either way, they were her only chance of getting out of the desert alive. Sarah made the difficult decision to reveal herself. She climbed to the highest point she could reach and began waving her arms frantically while shouting for help. The convoy was still too far away for her voice to carry, but she hoped someone might spot her movement against the rocks. For several agonizing minutes, the vehicles continued on their path without any sign that they had noticed her. Sarah felt despair creeping back into her heart as she watched her potential rescuers drive away. Then, just as the convoy was about to disappear over a ridge, the lead vehicle stopped and turned in her direction. Through the shimmering heat distortion, Sarah watched as several figures emerged from the vehicles and began scanning the area with what looked like binoculars. She continued waving and shouting until she saw one of them point directly at her position. The entire convoy turned and began moving toward the spring. As the vehicles got closer, Sarah could see that they were military-style trucks and jeeps, but she couldn't identify any specific markings or flags. The soldiers, if that's what they were, moved with professional efficiency and carried weapons that looked far more advanced than anything she had seen in movies or television. The lead vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the spring, and 6 heavily armed figures approached her position with their weapons ready, but not directly aimed at her. Their faces were covered with tactical masks, and they wore desert camouflage uniforms with no visible insignia or name tags. "Ma'am, step away from the rocks and keep your hands visible," called the leader, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. His accent was unmistakably American, which gave Sarah hope that these might be friendly forces. Sarah complied immediately, stumbling down from her perch with her hands raised high above her head. "Please help me," she called out. "I'm lost." Bad men left me here to die. The soldiers maintained their defensive positions as their leader approached her more closely. His eyes, visible above his tactical mask, were alert and professional as he assessed her condition. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked, his weapon lowered but still ready. "Sarah Martinez," she replied, her voice cracking with relief and dehydration. "I live in Phoenix. I was tricked into delivering a package, and when I got here, these men took my car and left me to die in the desert." The soldier studied her carefully for several moments before speaking into a radio attached to his vest. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she heard him mention her name and something about a civilian in distress. After a brief conversation on the radio, the soldier turned his attention back to Sarah. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to need you to answer some questions. First, can you describe the men who left you here?" Sarah provided as detailed a description as she could manage, including the foreign accent of the leader and the types of vehicles they had been driving. The soldier listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "What was in the package you were supposed to deliver?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," Sarah admitted. "It looked like computer parts and electronic components. The man who opened it seemed pleased with the contents, but I never got a good look at everything inside." The soldier exchanged glances with his team members, and Sarah could see them communicating through hand signals and radio whispers. Whatever she had unknowingly transported was clearly of great interest to these military personnel. "Mrs. Martinez, you've stumbled into something much bigger than you realize," the soldier finally said. "Those men you described are part of a terrorist cell that we've been tracking for months. The components you delivered are used to make sophisticated bombs and guidance systems." Sarah felt sick to her stomach as the full implications of her situation became clear. She had unknowingly aided terrorists, and now she was potentially a witness to a major counterterrorism operation. No wonder the men had been willing to kill her to keep her quiet. "Are you going to arrest me?" she asked, terrified that she might be charged as a criminal accomplice. "That's not my decision to make," the soldier replied. "But right now, you're a victim who needs medical attention and protection. We're going to get you to safety, and then people much smarter than me will figure out what to do next." The soldier gestured to his team, and two of them approached with a medical kit and water bottles. As they began treating Sarah's dehydration and examining her for injuries, the leader continued his questioning. "How did you find this location?" he asked. "Were you given specific coordinates, or did you navigate here some other way?" Sarah explained about the GPS coordinates Marcus had provided and how she had followed the tire tracks to find the mining camp. The soldier's expression grew more serious as he listened to her story. "Mrs. Martinez, those coordinates put you right in the middle of a known terrorist training facility. The fact that you're still alive suggests that our intelligence about this location might be incomplete." As the medics worked on Sarah, she could see more vehicles arriving in the distance. Whatever operation these soldiers were conducting was clearly much larger than she had first realized. Radio chatter filled the air as various team leaders reported their positions and status. The soldier who had been questioning her stepped away to confer with his superiors, leaving Sarah in the care of the medics. One of them, a young woman whose kind eyes were visible above her tactical mask, offered Sarah food and electrolyte drinks. "You're going to be okay," the medic assured her. "We're going to get you out of here and back to your family." "My daughter," Sarah said suddenly, remembering Emma with a rush of panic. "They know where I live. They threatened my daughter if I contacted the police." The medic immediately called for the team leader, who returned with a grim expression. "Mrs. Martinez, we're going to need you to give us your address and any other information about threats to your family. We have people who can provide protection." Sarah gave them all the information she could remember about Marcus, the men who had abandoned her, and the threats they had made against Emma. The soldier spoke rapidly into his radio, apparently coordinating with law enforcement agencies back in Phoenix. "Don't worry," he told her. "We're getting local police to your daughter's location right now. She'll be safe while we sort this mess out." As Sarah felt some of her terror subsiding, she began to notice more details about the military operation unfolding around her. The soldiers were clearly elite forces, moving with a precision and efficiency that spoke of extensive training and experience. Their equipment was state-of-the-art, and they communicated using codes and procedures that seemed far more sophisticated than regular Army units. "Who are you people?" Sarah asked the medic as she continued to receive treatment. The medic glanced toward the team leader before answering. "We're the good guys," she said simply. "That's all you need to know for now." Sarah was beginning to understand that she had inadvertently walked into the middle of a major counterterrorism operation. The men who had tried to kill her weren't just common criminals. They were part of something much larger and more dangerous. And these soldiers weren't regular military. They were specialists trained to handle exactly this type of threat. As the day wore on, more personnel arrived at the spring. Sarah watched in amazement as a fully equipped mobile command post was established, complete with satellite communication equipment and computer workstations. Intelligence analysts began arriving by helicopter, and Sarah could see them studying maps and photographs that seemed to show the entire region in incredible detail. The team leader approached Sarah again as the sun began to set. "Mrs. Martinez, we're going to evacuate you to a secure location where you can receive proper medical care and be debriefed by intelligence specialists. Your information about the terrorist cell's activities could be crucial to stopping future attacks." "What about the men who try to kill me?" Sarah asked. "Are you going to catch them?" The soldier's expression was grim but determined. "Ma'am, those men made a serious mistake when they left you alive. They have no idea that they've been under surveillance, and your testimony is going to help us take down their entire network." As night fell over the desert, Sarah was loaded into a medical helicopter for transport to what the soldiers described as a secure facility. As the aircraft lifted off, she could see dozens of vehicles converging on the area where she had nearly died, and she realized that her survival had set in motion a chain of events that would have far-reaching consequences. Looking down at the vast expanse of desert below, Sarah thought about how close she had come to becoming just another missing person whose fate would never be known. Instead, her determination to survive had not only saved her life, but had also provided crucial intelligence that might prevent future terrorist attacks. The helicopter banked toward the lights of distant cities, carrying Sarah away from the nightmare that had begun with a simple job offer and had nearly ended with her death in the desert. But even as she felt relief at being rescued, Sarah knew that her ordeal was far from over. She was now a key witness in a major counterterrorism investigation, and the men who had tried to kill her would stop at nothing to silence her permanently. As the aircraft flew through the night, Sarah held on to the promise that Emma was safe and that justice would eventually be served. She had survived against impossible odds, and now she was determined to see that the men who had tried to murder her would face the consequences of their actions. The desert below slowly gave way to the lights of civilization, but Sarah knew that her life would never be the same again. She had looked evil in the face and lived to tell about it, and that knowledge would change her forever. That the secure facility where Sarah was taken looked like something out of a movie. Located in an unmarked building complex outside Phoenix, it was surrounded by high walls, security cameras, and guards who carried weapons she had never seen before. Inside, the hallways were lined with monitors displaying satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and what appeared to be real-time tracking data. Sarah spent her first night at the facility in a medical unit where doctors confirmed that her ordeal in the desert had caused serious dehydration and heat exhaustion, but no permanent damage. More importantly, they assured her that Emma was safe and sound, staying with Mrs. Garcia under the protection of federal agents who were posing as family friends. The next morning, Sarah was introduced to Agent Jennifer Walsh, a tall woman with steel-gray eyes who explained that she worked for a joint task force dedicated to preventing domestic terrorism. Agent Walsh's manner was professional, but not unsympathetic as she laid out the scope of the investigation Sarah had stumbled into. "Mrs. Martinez, The package you delivered contains sophisticated electronic components that can be used to build remote detonation devices for large-scale attacks, Agent Walsh explained. The men who hired you are part of a cell that's been planning attacks on major infrastructure targets across the Southwest. Sarah felt sick as she realized how she had been used. I had no idea, she whispered. Marcus made it sound like a simple delivery job. I just needed the money for my daughter's medical bills. We know you're innocent, Agent Walsh assured her. Our investigation shows that this cell specifically targets desperate people for their courier services. They've used dozens of unwitting accomplices over the past year, and unfortunately, most of them didn't survive to tell their stories. The implications were chilling. Sarah realized that she wasn't the first person to be abandoned in the desert, and she might not be the last unless this terrorist cell was stopped. Her survival had given law enforcement their first live witness who could testify about the operation's methods. Over the next several days, Sarah was debriefed extensively about every detail of her experience. Intelligence analysts showed her hundreds of photographs, trying to identify the men who had abandoned her. They recorded her description of Marcus and had her work with a sketch artist to create detailed portraits of everyone involved. The breakthrough came when Sarah was shown surveillance footage from the restaurant where she had first met Marcus. The video clearly showed him arriving in a vehicle with two other men, and facial recognition software quickly identified all three as members of a terrorist organization with connections to international extremist groups. This is incredibly valuable intelligence, Agent Walsh told Sarah after the identification was confirmed. Marcus Hernandez is actually Malik Aurman, a bomb maker who's been on our watch list for 2 years. The other two men are his handlers from an overseas organization that's been trying to establish cells in the United States. Sarah learned that the terrorist cell had been using the remote desert location as both a training facility and a storage depot for weapons and explosives. The facility was hidden in an abandoned mining complex that satellite surveillance had missed because it was designed to look like natural rock formations from above. Your survival and testimony has given us the legal justification we need to raid their facility, Agent Walsh explained. Without a witness who could testify about criminal activity at that location, we couldn't get warrants to conduct a full investigation. As Sarah provided more details about the layout of the area and the equipment she had seen, military planners began developing a strategy for raiding the terrorist compound. She was amazed to learn that the soldiers who had rescued her were members of Delta Force, an elite counterterrorism unit that specialized in exactly this type of operation. The planning process was incredibly complex. Intelligence analysts used Sarah's descriptions, combined with satellite imagery and drone reconnaissance, to create detailed maps of the terrorist facility. They identified multiple buildings, weapon storage areas, and defensive positions that the terrorists had established. The problem is that we need to move quickly, explained Colonel Martinez, the Delta Force commander who briefed Sarah on the operation. Now that you've escaped, they know their location is compromised. They'll either move their operation or accelerate their attack timeline. Sarah was horrified to learn that intercepted communications suggested the terrorist cell was planning multiple simultaneous attacks on power plants, water treatment facilities, and transportation hubs. The components she had delivered were the final pieces they needed to build remote detonation systems that could cause massive casualties and economic damage. How many innocent people could die if you don't stop them? Sarah asked. Colonel Martinez's expression was grim. Potentially thousands. The targets they've selected are critical infrastructure points. If they succeed in destroying even half of them, it could cripple the entire Southwest region for months. The weight of responsibility Sarah felt was overwhelming. Her decision to trust Marcus and take a job that seemed too good to be true had nearly gotten her killed, but it had also put her in a position to prevent a catastrophic terrorist attack. Everything now depended on her ability to provide accurate information about what she had seen. As the raid planning intensified, Sarah was kept under constant protection at the secure facility. Intelligence reports indicated that the terrorist cell was actively searching for her, having realized that she might have survived her abandonment in the desert. Several attempts had been made to locate her through hospital records and missing person reports. "They're getting desperate," Agent Walsh told Sarah during one of their daily briefings. "Our electronic surveillance shows that they're preparing to abandon their current facility and move to a backup location. We have to strike within the next 48 hours or we'll lose them." The night before the raid, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the men who had tried to kill her and all the innocent people who might die if the mission failed. She also worried about Emma, who still didn't fully understand why they were staying with Mrs. Garcia under the protection of federal agents. Colonel Martinez visited Sarah's room that evening to go over her testimony one final time. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that your courage has made this operation possible. Without your survival and cooperation, these terrorists would have succeeded in their plans." "I don't feel courageous," Sarah admitted. "I feel terrified and guilty for getting involved in the first place." "Courage isn't about not being afraid," the colonel replied. "It's about doing the right thing, even when you are afraid. You've shown remarkable strength throughout this ordeal, and tomorrow that strength is going to help save lives." The raid was scheduled for dawn, when the terrorists would be least alert and the desert heat wouldn't compromise the performance of the Delta Force soldiers. Sarah would remain at the secure facility, watching the operation unfold through satellite feeds and radio communications. As she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life, Sarah thought about how drastically her world had changed in just 1 week. She had gone from being a struggling single mother to a key witness in a major counterterrorism operation. More importantly, she had discovered reserves of strength and determination she never knew she possessed. The pre-dawn hours passed slowly as Sarah waited for news from the raid. Agent Walsh sat with her in a conference room equipped with multiple screens showing real-time intelligence feeds. Radio chatter filled the air as various military units moved into position around the terrorist facility. "Alpha Team in position," came the first report from the field. "Target area appears active. Multiple heat signatures detected in primary buildings." Sarah watched the satellite feed show tiny figures moving across the desert toward the mining complex where she had nearly died. The soldiers moved like shadows, approaching the terrorist stronghold with deadly precision. "Bravo Team reports secondary targets secured," announced another voice over the radio. No resistance encountered at perimeter positions. As the operation unfolded, Sarah was amazed by the coordination and professionalism of the Delta Force units. They had trained for months for this type of mission, and it showed in every movement and decision they made. "Charlie Team has eyes on primary target building," reported Colonel Martinez, confirming 3 subjects inside main structure. Weapons and explosive materials visible. Sarah held her breath as she watched the final assault begin. Soldiers moved with lightning speed, surrounding the buildings and neutralizing any resistance before the terrorists could react. Within minutes, the radio crackled with confirmation that all targets had been secured and the facility was under military control. "All units, this is command," announced Colonel Martinez. "Operation is complete. All hostile targets are in custody. Substantial weapons and explosive materials have been secured." Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that the nightmare was finally over. The men who had tried to kill her were in custody, their terrorist plot had been stopped, and countless innocent lives had been saved. But even as she celebrated the successful raid, Sarah knew that her role in the operation wasn't finished. She would need to testify in federal court, helping to ensure that the terrorists faced justice for their crimes. More importantly, her story would serve as a warning to others about how terrorist organizations recruit unwitting accomplices. As dawn broke over the desert, Sarah watched the satellite feed show Delta Force soldiers loading explosives and weapons from the terrorist facility. The operation had recovered enough destructive materials to level several city blocks, and intelligence documents that revealed connections to terrorist cells in other states. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that you've helped prevent one of the most significant domestic terrorist attacks in recent history, Agent Walsh told her as they watched the raid's aftermath unfold. Your survival and testimony have saved countless lives. Sarah thought about Emma, who would soon be able to return to their normal life, and about all the other families who would never know how close they had come to tragedy. Her decision to fight for survival in the desert had set in motion a chain of events that had far-reaching consequences for national security. As she prepared to leave the secure facility and return to her daughter, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned about trust, survival, and the importance of doing the right thing even when it seemed impossible. She had faced evil and lived to tell about it, and that knowledge would guide her for the rest of her life. The desert had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, but it had also revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. Sarah Martinez had entered that wasteland as a victim, but she was leaving as a hero whose courage had helped protect her country from those who would do it harm 3 months after the desert raid. Sarah Martinez stood in a federal courthouse in Phoenix, her hand raised as she prepared to testify against the men who had tried to kill her. The courtroom was packed with FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and media representatives who understood they were witnessing a landmark terrorism case. In the defendant's box sat Marcus Hernandez, whose real name was Malik Aurman, along with his 2 associates. The men who had seemed so threatening in the desert now looked ordinary and defeated, dressed in orange prison uniforms with shackles around their ankles. They avoided making eye contact with Sarah, perhaps realizing that their decision to leave her alive had been their greatest mistake. Federal prosecutor Rebecca Chun approached the witness stand with a confident stride. Over the past months, she had worked closely with Sarah to prepare her testimony, ensuring that every detail of the terrorist plot would be presented clearly to the jury. Mrs. Martinez, please tell the court how you first came to meet the defendant Marcus Hernandez. Prosecutor Chun began. Sarah took a deep breath and launched into the story that had changed her life forever. She described the financial pressures that had made her vulnerable to Marcus's recruitment, the false promises of easy money, and her growing realization that she was being used as an unwitting accomplice in a terrorist operation. As Sarah testified, she could see the jury members leaning forward in their seats, captivated by her first-hand account of survival and espionage. Several jurors looked horrified when she described being abandoned in the desert with no water, and others nodded approvingly when she explained how she had managed to stay alive long enough for rescue. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Robert Stevens, attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by suggesting that she had been a willing participant in the terrorist plot. His strategy quickly backfired as Sarah calmly explained how she had been deceived and manipulated by professionals who preyed on desperate people. Mrs. Martinez, the defense suggests that you knew exactly what you were transporting, Stevens said during cross-examination. Isn't it true that you were paid a substantial sum precisely because you understood the illegal nature of your cargo? Sarah looked directly at the defense attorney, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Stevens, I was a single mother struggling to pay my daughter's medical bills. I was told I was delivering computer equipment to a business client. If I had known I was transporting bomb components for terrorists, I would have called the FBI immediately. The prosecutor presented evidence showing that the terrorist cell had used dozens of unwitting couriers over the previous year, most of whom had simply disappeared after completing their deliveries. Sarah's survival had broken the pattern and exposed the entire operation. Expert witnesses testified about the sophisticated nature of the electronic components Sarah had transported, explaining to the jury how they could be used to create remote detonation devices capable of causing mass casualties. The testimony painted a chilling picture of the attacks that had been prevented by Sarah's courage and the subsequent Delta Force raid. Colonel Martinez, the Delta Force commander who had overseen Sarah's rescue, testified about the intelligence value of her information and how it had enabled the successful raid on the terrorist facility. His testimony was classified in many respects, but he was able to describe the weapons and explosives that had been recovered and the evidence of planned attacks on critical infrastructure. Without Mrs. Martinez's survival and testimony, this terrorist cell would likely have succeeded in conducting multiple simultaneous attacks on power plants, water treatment facilities, and transportation networks, Colonel Martinez told the court. Her information was directly responsible for preventing what could have been the most devastating domestic terrorist attack in decades. The trial lasted for 2 weeks, during which Sarah was required to testify on multiple occasions. Each time she took the stand, she felt the weight of responsibility for ensuring that justice was served. The men who tried to kill her represented everything she despised about people who preyed on the innocent and vulnerable. During breaks in the proceedings, Sarah was approached by victims' rights advocates who praised her courage in testifying against such dangerous defendants. Many of them were family members of people who had been killed in previous terrorist attacks, and they understood better than anyone the importance of holding terrorists accountable for their crimes. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Sarah was asked to describe the moment she realized the men intended to leave her to die in the desert. Her voice broke as she recalled the terror she had felt when they threatened her daughter, and several jury members were visibly moved by her testimony. They told me that if I somehow survived and contacted police, they would kill Emma, Sarah said through tears. That's when I realized they weren't just criminals. They were monsters who would murder a child to protect their operation. The defense's case was weak and unconvincing. They attempted to argue that their clients were simply following orders from overseas handlers and didn't fully understand the consequences of their actions. This strategy fell apart when prosecutors presented evidence showing that the defendants had conducted extensive reconnaissance of their targets and had detailed knowledge of the casualties their attacks would cause. Intercepted communications between the defendants and their overseas contacts revealed the cold-blooded nature of their planning. They had discussed the potential for thousands of deaths with casual indifference, viewing American civilians as acceptable targets in their ideological war. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus Hernandez and his associates were convicted of conspiracy to commit terrorism, possession of weapons of mass destruction, attempted murder, and numerous other federal crimes that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. As the verdicts were read, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, satisfaction that the men who had tried to kill her would face consequences, but also sadness for all the lives that had been disrupted by their actions. She thought about the other families who hadn't been as fortunate as hers, whose loved ones had been murdered by terrorists before they could be stopped. Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over the trial with firm authority, addressed the defendants before sentencing. Your actions represent the worst of humanity, the willingness to murder innocent people in service of a twisted ideology. Mrs. Martinez's survival and testimony have ensured that you will never again have the opportunity to harm others. Marcus Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while his associates received sentences of 60 and 40 years respectively. The sentences sent a clear message to other terrorist organizations that domestic attacks would be met with the full force of American justice. After the trial concluded, Sarah was approached by FBI Director Sarah Patterson, who personally thanked her for her cooperation with the investigation. Mrs. Martinez, your courage has made America safer, Director Patterson said. Your testimony has also provided valuable intelligence that will help us prevent similar attacks in the future. Sarah learned that the investigation sparked by her testimony had uncovered terrorist cells in 3 other states, leading to dozens of additional arrests. The international connections revealed during the trial had also provided foreign intelligence agencies with information needed to disrupt terrorist networks overseas. The media coverage of the trial made Sarah a reluctant public figure, with reporters describing her as an American hero who had risked everything to stop a terrorist attack. She appeared on several national news programs, using the platform to warn others about how terrorist organizations recruit unwitting accomplices. They specifically target people who are desperate and vulnerable, Sarah explained during an interview with CNN. They prey on single mothers, unemployed workers, and anyone else who might be tempted by what seems like easy money. I want people to understand that if a job seems too good to be true, it probably is. The experience had changed Sarah in fundamental ways. She had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she possessed, but she had also developed a healthy skepticism about trusting strangers with attractive offers. Most importantly, she had learned that ordinary people could make an extraordinary difference when they refused to give up in the face of evil. Emma, now 9 years old, had struggled to understand why their lives had been turned upside down for several months. Sarah had tried to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms, emphasizing that sometimes bad people try to hurt innocent families, but good people work hard to stop them. "Mommy, are the bad men go to prison forever?" Emma asked after the sentencing. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah replied, holding her daughter close. "They can never hurt anyone else again." The financial compensation Sarah received from the federal government's Victim Assistance Program allowed her to pay Emma's medical bills and establish a college fund for her daughter's future education. More importantly, it gave them the security to rebuild their lives without the constant worry about money that had made Sarah vulnerable to Marcus's recruitment in the first place. As she reflected on the experience, Sarah realized that her ordeal in the desert had taught her valuable lessons about resilience, determination, and the importance of fighting for what's right. She had faced down killers, survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and helped prevent a devastating terrorist attack. The trauma of her experience would stay with her forever, but so would the knowledge that she had made a difference. Sarah Martinez had entered the desert as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but she had emerged as a survivor who had helped protect her country from those who would do it harm. Law enforcement agencies across the country now use Sarah's case as a training example, teaching agents how to identify and investigate terrorist recruitment networks. Her story had become part of the official record of American counterterrorism efforts, ensuring that her sacrifice and courage would not be forgotten. As Sarah tucked Emma into bed on the night after the sentencing, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing for months. The men who had tried to kill her were in prison, their terrorist plot had been stopped, and her family was safe. She had survived the ultimate test of human endurance and had emerged stronger than before. Looking out the window at the lights of Phoenix in the distance, Sarah thought about the thousands of people who were sleeping safely because of the action she had taken in the desert. Her decision to fight for survival had set in motion a chain of events that had saved countless lives, and that knowledge would sustain her for the rest of her life. The desert had tested her in ways she never could have imagined, but it had also revealed the true power of human determination when faced with impossible odds. Sarah Martinez had proven that even when abandoned by those who should protect us, the human spirit could triumph over evil through courage, intelligence, and an unwavering refusal to surrender. 2 years after the terrorist trial that had made her a national hero, Sarah Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at Arizona State University, preparing to deliver the keynote address at a conference on domestic terrorism prevention. The audience included FBI agents, security professionals, college students, and community leaders who had come to hear firsthand from the woman who had helped prevent one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in American history. Sarah had transformed herself from a struggling single mother into a respected advocate for national security awareness. She worked as a consultant for federal law enforcement agencies, helping them understand how terrorist organizations recruit unwitting accomplices and developing strategies to prevent similar recruitment efforts in the future. 3 years ago, I was just like many of you, Sarah began her address. I was a single mother working 2 jobs, struggling to pay bills and provide for my daughter. I never imagined that my desperate financial situation would make me a target for terrorists who saw me as the perfect unwitting accomplice. The audience listened intently as Sarah recounted her story, from the initial meeting with Marcus through her survival in the desert and the subsequent investigation that had dismantled an international terrorist network. She spoke about the psychological tactics that terrorist recruiters use to identify and manipulate vulnerable people, They don't look for criminals, Sarah explained. They look for honest, hardworking people who are facing financial crises or personal emergencies. They offer solutions that seem legitimate and legal, preying on our natural desire to provide for our families and solve our problems. Sarah's work had contributed to the development of new training programs for law enforcement officers, teaching them to recognize the signs of terrorist recruitment in their communities. She had also helped create educational materials for social workers, teachers, and community organizations that worked with at-risk populations. The impact of her efforts extended far beyond the United States. International security agencies had consulted with Sarah about terrorist recruitment tactics, and her insights had helped prevent similar operations in Canada, Australia, and several European countries. The men who tried to kill me believed they had chosen the perfect victim, Sarah continued. They saw a desperate woman who would transport their bomb components without asking questions and then disappear forever. They never imagined that I would survive their attempt to murder me or that my testimony would expose their entire network. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a professor of criminology who had been studying terrorist recruitment patterns. Dr. Carter had written extensively about Sarah's case and its implications for understanding how extremist organizations operate in democratic societies. Mrs. Martinez, your survival and subsequent actions have fundamentally changed how we approach counterterrorism prevention, Dr. Carter told her. The recruitment model you exposed has been identified in dozens of other cases since your trial, leading to hundreds of arrests and the prevention of numerous attacks. Sarah learned that the intelligence gathered from her case had been instrumental in developing new surveillance techniques and investigative procedures. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had created psychological profiles of terrorist recruiters based partly on her descriptions of Marcus and his manipulation tactics. The ripple effects of Sarah's experience continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Emma, now 11 years old, had become fascinated with criminal justice and announced her intention to become an FBI agent when she grew up. Her school had started a security awareness program after Sarah spoke to the Parent-Teacher Association about recognizing potential threats. "Mom, do you ever wish you had never taken that job from Marcus?" Emma asked one evening as they walked through their neighborhood in Phoenix. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Sweetheart, I wish I had been smarter about recognizing the warning signs. But I don't regret what happened afterward. Sometimes terrible things happen to good people, but those experiences can also create opportunities to help others and make the world safer." The financial security that had come from Sarah's consulting work and the Victim Compensation Fund had allowed them to move to a better neighborhood and provide Emma with opportunities that would have been impossible before. More importantly, the experience had taught both mother and daughter valuable lessons about resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. Sarah's advocacy work had also led to important policy changes at the federal level. Congress had passed new legislation requiring employers to conduct more thorough background checks on delivery and transportation personnel, making it harder for terrorist organizations to recruit unwitting accomplices. The Department of Homeland Security had implemented new training requirements for law enforcement agencies, ensuring that officers across the country understood how to identify and investigate terrorist recruitment activities. Sarah had personally trained thousands of agents, sharing her insights about the psychological manipulation tactics used by extremist organizations. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah's story had become part of the standard curriculum at the FBI Academy in Quantico. New agents studied her case to understand how ordinary citizens could become unwitting participants in terrorist plots and how their survival and cooperation could provide crucial intelligence for counterterrorism operations. The most important thing I learned from my experience is that terrorists depend on our silence and our fear, Sarah told a group of new FBI recruits during a visit to the academy. They count on victims being too scared or too ashamed to come forward. When we refuse to be silenced, we take away their power. The international impact of Sarah's case had been equally significant. The European Union had adopted new guidelines for investigating terrorist recruitment networks, based partly on the methods used to uncover the cell that had targeted Sarah. Similar programs have been implemented in countries across Asia and the Middle East. Intelligence agencies had used the information from Sarah's case to map terrorist connections across multiple continents, leading to coordinated raids that had disrupted planning for attacks in major cities around the world. The electronic components that Sarah had unwittingly transported had been traced back to their manufacturers, revealing supply chains that had been used to support terrorist operations in dozens of countries. Colonel Martinez, who had led the Delta Force raid on the terrorist facility, had remained in contact with Sarah over the years. He often spoke about her case when training special operations forces, emphasizing how civilian cooperation could provide the intelligence needed to prevent catastrophic attacks. Mrs. Martinez's courage under extreme circumstances saved countless lives, Colonel Martinez told a gathering of special operations commanders. Her case demonstrates why we must never underestimate the importance of protecting and supporting civilian witnesses, even when their initial involvement in terrorist activities was involuntary. As Sarah's reputation as a counterterrorism expert grew, she began working with international organizations dedicated to preventing violent extremism. She consulted with the United Nations on developing programs to help countries identify and disrupt terrorist recruitment networks in their communities. The psychological research inspired by Sarah's case had led to breakthroughs in understanding how extremist organizations manipulated their targets. Universities across the country had established research programs dedicated to studying the intersection of terrorism, psychology, and community vulnerability. Dr. Michael Roberts, a psychologist at Georgetown University, had spent 3 years studying the tactics used to recruit Sarah and other unwitting accomplices. His research had identified common patterns that could be used to train community leaders and social workers to recognize when someone might be targeted by extremist groups. Sarah Martinez's case provides a perfect example of how terrorists exploit legitimate economic pressures to recruit accomplices, Dr. Roberts explained during a symposium on domestic terrorism prevention. By understanding their methods, we can develop early intervention strategies that protect vulnerable individuals before they become involved in criminal activities. The educational impact of Sarah's story had extended into high schools and colleges across the country. Criminal justice programs regularly invited her to speak to students about the real-world implications of their studies and the importance of remaining vigilant against extremist recruitment efforts. Sarah had also worked with community organizations to develop programs for immigrants and refugees who were often targeted by terrorist recruiters because of their economic vulnerability and social isolation. These programs taught people how to recognize and report suspicious recruitment activities while connecting them with legitimate resources for financial assistance and job training. The technology industry had also been affected by Sarah's case. The revelation that common electronic components could be easily modified for use in terrorist attacks had led to new security protocols for manufacturers and distributors of sensitive equipment. Sarah served on advisory committees that helped develop new tracking systems for electronic components that could be used in weapon construction. These systems had already prevented several attempts by terrorist organizations to acquire materials for bomb-making activities. As she reflected on the changes that had occurred since her ordeal in the desert, Sarah was amazed by the far-reaching consequences of her survival and testimony. What had begun as a personal tragedy had evolved into a comprehensive effort to protect communities from terrorist recruitment and attack. "I never expected that my experience would have such a wide impact," Sarah told a gathering of victim advocates. "But I've learned that when we refuse to be silenced by those who try to harm us, we can create positive changes that extend far beyond our own lives." Emma had grown into a confident and articulate young woman who often accompanied her mother to speaking engagements. She had developed her own perspectives on security and justice, shaped by growing up in the aftermath of her mother's extraordinary experience. "My mom taught me that bad things sometimes happen to good people, but we get to choose how we respond," Emma told a group of her classmates during a presentation about careers in law enforcement. She could have let what happened make her afraid and bitter, but instead she decided to use her experience to help protect other families. As Sarah looked toward the future, she felt a sense of satisfaction about the work she had accomplished and optimism about the continued impact of her advocacy efforts. The men who had tried to kill her were serving life sentences in federal prison. Their terrorist network had been completely dismantled, and the intelligence gathered from her case continued to prevent attacks around the world. The desert that had nearly claimed her life had instead become the crucible that forged her into a powerful force for justice and security. Sarah Martinez had proven that even in the face of overwhelming evil, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights of courage and determination. Standing in her backyard on a warm Phoenix evening, Sarah could see the distant mountains where her ordeal had begun. The harsh landscape that had tested her survival skills now reminded her of the strength she had discovered within herself and the positive changes that had resulted from her refusal to surrender. She had entered that desert as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, but she had emerged as a guardian who dedicated her life to protecting others from the forces of hatred and extremism. The terrorists who had abandoned her to die had unwittingly created their most effective opponent, and Sarah Martinez would continue fighting for justice and security for as long as she drew breath. The true power of Delta Force, Sarah realized, wasn't just in their military capabilities or their advanced equipment. It was in their ability to recognize courage wherever they found it, and to support that courage in whatever form it took. They had saved her life in the desert, but more importantly, they had given her the opportunity to save countless other lives through her testimony and advocacy. As the sun set over the Arizona landscape, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the edge of death to a position of national prominence in the fight against terrorism. She had learned that survival was about more than just staying alive. It was about using the strength gained through adversity to make the world a better and safer place for future generations. Her story would continue to inspire others who faced seemingly impossible challenges, proving that with determination, courage, and the support of good people, it was possible to triumph over even the most determined enemies. Sarah Martinez had become living proof that the human spirit, when tested to its limits, could emerge stronger and more determined than ever before.